9/11 was a really big deal. That may seem like a no-brainer, but there is a reason it is considered the worst terrorist attack in modern history. To really grasp how big a deal the September 11th terrorist attacks were, you need to understand how powerful the United States of America was in 2001. The Soviet Union was long gone. China was not the powerhouse it is today. The European Union was less than a decade old, and the American economy was booming. In short, the United States had no real rivals in its global dominance. In fact, it was so dominant that some historians consider the 2001 United States as something more than just a superpower. They refer to it as a hyperpower. And yet, despite all of this, on September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked and crashed 4 airplanes, killing just under 3,000 innocent civilians in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. It was more than just the United States that had been caught off guard. It was the entire world. And that was a problem. So what's the solution? Well, it's the uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act of 2001, better known as the Patriot Act. The act passed in Congress with 98 votes in the Senate and 357 votes in the House, a total landslide. Basically, the Patriot Act lacked many of the civil liberties and privacy protections put in place by the 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, largely known as FISA. FISA had allowed for the government, the FBI really, to spy on Americans with vague warrants if and only if it was done electronically, that means a wiretap, and for the explicit purpose of collecting foreign intelligence and counterintelligence. Spying on Americans in any other capacity was illegal, and evidence collected in such ways would not be allowed in courts and would be ordered to be destroyed. If intelligence had been collected under FISA with the intention to be used in courts, the FBI was ordered to inform the accused of that fact so that they may contest the evidence's use. But now, under the Patriot Act, that changed. The FBI no longer had to notify Americans that they were being looked into. Warrants could now cover multiple people and could extend outside the individual court's jurisdictions. To get that warrant, the FBI no longer had to prove that their suspicions against Americans were reasonable and articulable like they had to do under FISA. And then, the FBI was no longer limited to simple wiretaps, and under the Patriot Act, the definition of foreign intelligence was broadened. Ultimately, the Patriot Act turned into something much uglier than it was intended to be. Under the Patriot Act, the U.S. government was authorized to deport, detain, and freeze the assets of individuals for any relation to disfavorable groups, all without trial. The FBI could label anyone who stepped out of U.S. law as a member of a disfavorable group, no matter how minimal that may have been. That meant that an unruly protest, for example, inconvenient but not a threat, could get the participants labeled as domestic terrorists. And this may sound ridiculous, but the FBI really stretched what qualified as disfavorable behavior. They even subverted the First Amendment, all in the name of dealing with the terrorists. Americans were suddenly held in contempt for not just speaking out against U.S. policy, but for speech they had orated in the past. For example, A pair of Palestinians, despite having lived in the US for 3 decades at that point, were deported for distributing Free Palestine pamphlets 20 years earlier. Not only does that go against free speech, but it predated the Patriot Act's enactment. These green card holding Americans were forced out of the country for something that was both legal and much earlier than the Patriot Act. And this is just one of many cases where free speech, arguably the most sacred of American constitutional values, was infringed upon. Now, as a whole, Americans are known to be very protective of their constitutional rights. But many of the Patriot Act's targets were Arab immigrants or of Arab descent. After 9/11, an awful wave of Islamophobia swept the United States. Crimes against Muslim and Arab Americans skyrocketed. They were met with amounts of suspicion and dehumanization that they were not subject to prior to 9/11. Around the Patriot Act, other government-sponsored crimes were being committed against them. Even as late as 2008, presidential nominee Barack Obama was accused of being anti-American since his middle name was Hussein, like Saddam Hussein. And despite the overt discrimination, despite the overt infringement on the First Amendment, the Patriot Act remained popular. In fact, it operated under a sunset clause, meaning it had to be renewed by Congress every few years, and it was passed again and again until it finally failed in the House of Representatives in 2020. That's 19 years of the Patriot Act. Still, the US government retains many of the privileges that the Patriot Act granted them. Meanwhile, the United States launched its 2003 invasion into Iraq in search of nuclear weapons that turned out to be non-existent. Similarly, and despite the American Department of Justice continuing to uphold the stance that the Patriot Act was a resounding success, little evidence exists to prove that the Patriot Act was actually successful at fighting terrorism. Rather, in retrospect, it is generally viewed as clumsy, intrusive, and worst of all, unconstitutional. The Patriot Act will forever have its place in American history as a reminder of the consequences of letting fear drive people and government in the face of crisis. We can only hope that in the future, the same mistakes will not be made again.